Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Here's a question for you. Can we trust the public to do the right thing? Not because someone's watching or threatening to fine them, but because they actually want to. Do we really need heavy-handed rules, constant surveillance, and an ever-growing rulebook to keep people in line? Or can we just simply trust them? Let them do the right thing because they believe in it? And that's the deceptively simple and yet delightfully complicated question at the heart of today's discussion with Professor Yuval Feldman. Now, Yuval isn't just any guest. He was the very first person I interviewed on this show, and he's been back since then. Every time I speak to him on the show and in person, he gets me thinking differently. He's a huge inspiration on me, both my work and me personally, and as I think about rules, ethics, and the way we try and shape human behaviour. And he's got a new book out called Can the Public Be Trusted? The Promise and Perils of Voluntary Compliance. And it flips the usual trust conversation on its head. Because most of the time when people talk about trust and regulation, they're worrying about how little the public trusts government. But Yuval's asking the opposite question. How much do governments actually trust the public? And more importantly, should they? Because here's the interesting thing. When people comply voluntarily, when they follow the rules because they want to, not because they're forced to, the outcomes are usually better. Systems are more sustainable, they're less expensive, and more resilient. But in spite of all of that, voluntary compliance is the thing regulators seem most nervous about relying on. So in this episode, we're going to dig into that tension, looking at case studies from tax compliance to environmental policy to responses to the pandemic, and have a look at the psychology of rule following, the danger of misplaced trust, and why good intentions sometimes lead to bad regulation. Yuval's work sits right at the intersection of behavioural science and the law, and one of the reasons he really inspires me is because he takes complex ideas and makes them understandable and engaging for the rest of us. If you haven't heard his previous appearances on the show, I strongly recommend checking those out. You'll find links to those in the show notes. Whether you're returning to or discovering his work for the first time, you are in for a real treat. So let's get into the conversation. And I began by asking Yuval how he first got interested in this idea of trusting the public and what he's learned from studying the way people and institutions behave.
The idea was that there are those people who actually means well, but some of what the findings of other researchers and myself actually show those people to be the hardest type of population to regulate, in a sense that those people who thinks that their own behavior is within the premise of the law are actually the hardest to deal with because they don't feel almost any guilt for what they do. They think, this is within what's accepted, and with all those ethical biases that prevent them from understanding. So you can see the flow kind of where, explaining all that and then kind of ending with some problems with people evaluation of their own ethicality. And this current project starts with the question, can we trust the public? And actually, and we can talk more about it later, comes with all the advantages of the fact that people will do or will comply, not just because they are told to do it, not just because they are afraid of sanctions, but because someone will convince them that complying is the right thing to do. So in a sense, the project started with me thinking, can we actually get people not just to comply, but to want to comply? And psychology and behavioral economics give us all kind of explanation why that might be better in terms of enforcement cost, in terms of effect on culture, positive spillovers, beyond compliance, sustainable in terms of, enduring when sanctions are not around anymore, monitoring is limited. So a lot of advantages. And we all have this intuition, right, that I think we take it from sometimes what's called like an honor test in elementary school, where the teachers goes out of the class and tell the students, I'm not going to, oversee how you do your exams. I'm going to trust you. And we have this intuition that if the students learn not to cheat when no teacher is in class, it's actually a better practice. And so this is kind of the original idea. later on, once you go through the book, you see more and more chapters talking about things like, crowding out, and about the limits of trust, and about culture, and about the perils of voluntary compliance. Happy to talk more about any of those topics. We come to realize, and also when we go through the case studies, so the tax compliance, environmental compliance, lessons from COVID compliance, all of those things actually suggest that in many ways, first, we don't have enough evidence for the advantages of intrinsically motivated compliance over more kind of extrinsically motivated compliance. Second, when we ask the question, can the public be trusted? Probably the most accurate answer is depends who, depends when, and depends to what extent. And all those, moderators in statistics, or kind of those constraints of the main effect of the general arguments, actually suggest that it's a very delicate answer. And then there's also all kind of legal problems. So, I'm not just a psychologist, I'm also or even mainly a legal scholar. And to some extent, some answers I get from people when I talk about the book, and you ask about the feedback that I get, some people say, if the choice is between trusting some people or trusting no one, maybe it's better to trust no one. And I think that's an interesting argument, where because of things like, discrimination and all kind of legitimate worries about how the world would look like if we take those people who were trusted and actually use that to shirk or to actually even do even worse things. And then the question is, could we trust those people again? Or what happens if we trust someone again and again and again that he keeps failing us? So, it's not an easy solution, but part of what I try in the book is actually to give people kind of the full picture and let them decide to some extent. And this is another feedback I got, is that there is no very strong conclusion in the book. It's more kind of, this is a super fundamental question in compliance and regulation, is to what extent can we actually rely on things, trust, all those honesty nudges. I mean, a lot of things which are moving in this kind of trust-based regulation, self-regulation, allowing corporations to govern themselves to some extent. So those are fundamental questions, but the answer is not you can trust or you cannot trust. It's so complex. And then the question is, how do we know? Does it worth it? To what extent we should do it? And happy to, to develop more on each of those.
And I love that what you're pointing at here is this is not easy, right? And we love simple black and white solutions. We all intuitively know we've seen the worst of both worlds and we've seen the best of both worlds. And we recognize that there are certain situations that lend themselves, even if not behaviorally, logistically, to one or the other. If we can't monitor people, maybe we do have to trust them. And if we've been stung before, or we're in a regulated environment where the regulator expects certain things, then maybe we have to behave in a different manner. And I love the fact that you bring out the nuance here. And what you're kind of doing is going, this is actually really hard, right? We have to think about what we're doing to work out what's most effective. Now, I love that you're going there, but for some people that's challenging because it's much easier to sort of go, well, we'll just do it this way because that's the way we've always done it, or that's what we perceive is the right answer. And I love the fact that you're coming at this as a lawyer because you understand the logic that gets us to the non-trusting space. The legal case is argued theoretically stronger, looks and feels safer. We can document it, all those kinds of things. You're very comfortable with this being uncomfortable.
Yes, and I think in many ways, exactly what you describe is part of the challenge of psychology and behavioral economics, trying, get a seat at the table with regard to policymaking. So when I kind of started my work on behavioral economics and law and economics and rational choice was seen as the main kind of paradigm. Everyone is, incentives, this is what we're going to do. We're going to raise the price of undesirable behavior. People are going to consume it less, so we are better off, and things like that. And then the whole kind of, Tversky and Kahneman limits of cognition, in coming to the realization that actually, despite our, as you suggest, assuming that people are rational, make our life really easy because you know what to do, right? I mean, you do that. This is going to be the reality. But with the rise of also empirical legal studies, we came to realize it just doesn't work that way. People, sometimes sanctions have the opposite, the reverse effect than what you expect. Sometimes it has all kind of interactions, right? So interactions is exactly this nuanced idea that for certain people, the same treatment will lead to different directions, or sometimes even conflicting directions. And the question is, do we say, oh, this is too complex, let's just assume? And some law and economics people say that, we can't deal with so much noise and so much complexity because at the end of the day, and this is a legitimate fear, policymakers and regulators will say, you know what, if you give us such a complex answers, maybe we shouldn't listen to scientists at all. I mean, if you don't help us, and it depends, and context matter, and culture matter, and doctrine, and what kind of organization, what kind of behavior, all those questions you expect us to ask ourselves before making a move is actually constraining. We can't build policy, and so the whole behavioral revolution, as I see it, dealt with the same critique. I don't know if it's your own view. You just for the sake of the discussion, suggest, if it's so complex, you're not helping. But I think, if reality is complex, our job is to show reality and, deal with it, not say, let's sugarcoat things for you and don't worry that it's not accurate.
Now, for the record, my view is that we should face up to it, right? Because I think ignoring complexity doesn't make it go away,
right,
is my simple view. And I think if we don't, we run the risk of relying on a toolkit that may sometimes work, but we should be aware that no intervention is 100% guaranteed to work with everybody. And I think understanding that also points you in a direction of being realistic about. I mean, you said this in your previous book. 100% compliance is challenging. I'll put it that way. And so when we look at it, actually recognizing that, I think then goes to how we market what compliance can do and what it can't do, and therefore the risks that we're running, and therefore we've got a better handle on it. So I think the points you make are great. I can just see that it's uncomfortable reading for certain people, but we shouldn't be living comfortable lives. We need to recognize the realities. And so, as you were looking at trust, you mentioned the fact you've got case studies in the book, and tax is something that we all recognize and we all understand. And so I loved it for its universality, but I think it's also a really interesting place to play because we've seen lots of examples of people trying different techniques. Did that naturally come to you as an obvious place to look at? Or were you sort of spoiled for choice?
So I think if you look at empirical studies on compliance, it seems to me that tax and environment probably are the two legal doctrine with the papers, discussion projects for different reasons. And I think this part of the thing I do in the book is actually try to use those three case studies, tax and health in the context of COVID, but even beyond, as three paradigm types of behaviors we need to change. So tax, again, a lot of kind of idea where people are to some extent being trusted to come up with their own data on their kind of income, about their expenses, about source of income. Not all of it is, even today with what the world is really like almost without cash. And we move in a direction where everything is supposedly traceable. There are still a lot of discretion that people have. Not everyone, not to the same. And therefore, I think it's very, very interesting to kind of try to deal with this question that, even Machiavelli started. What's to have, people should fear the taxes, really do everything out of, I don't want to deal with them. I just want to, do everything perfectly without them running after me, or, focus on things related to procedural justice or legitimacy or reasoning, or, explaining to what the taxes are being used. But again, as I started about kind of the move from optimism to pessimism, to some extent, the conclusion with regard to is even the most disappointing because for a couple of reasons. First, when I compare, for example, environmental and tax to in many ways, with regard to the environment, we need we need more true believers than we need with tax. And this is an environment, many of the behaviors cannot be really regulated. So, things related consumer choices that you have a lot in the environment world, you don't have in the tax. In tax, it's not a daily thing. Usually, for many people, it could be once a year, twice a year. So it's not some routine that you need to. Third, I mean, when I talk to tax people, say, we have no interest in people smiling when they pay tax. It's okay. It's the same for us if they hate us or love us when they pay the taxes, which is not when it comes to environment. An example I use from COVID era is the difference between wearing a mask and getting the vaccine. Getting the vaccine is similar to tax. Why? Because once you got people to the clinic, they give you their shoulder, you give them the vaccine, that's it. Even if they're very upset, it's as effective. That the mask is something you do on a daily basis, and usually where it's if you don't cover your nose, it's almost ineffective. Very hard to give someone a fine where his nose, right? So you are actually more dependent on intrinsic motivation on this kind of voluntary compliance in a different way than the vaccine, where it's very monitored, right? I know whether you got the vaccine or not. And again, whether you smiled in the clinic, it's meaningless to us. And in that regard, tax is, so a lot of the things actually suggest that this whole idea of intrinsically motivated tax compliance is not that important. And above all, and this is something before peer review, it's just a working paper. We actually did some meta-analysis of a couple of tax morale papers. So that, taxes should be paid as a kind of a moral principle, and try to run it on, compare it in effect on intention. So it's more kind of attitude and actual behavior. So in papers where the tax compliance was based on whether you actually pay the tax. So there are kind of studies where people play tax games and, you get an income, and then you try to measure how much is, the percentage of the reported income from their actual income, because you can monitor. And we actually find a negative effect of tax morale on actual behavior, which is very surprising, which is we are kind of now at a stage of trying to understand what to do with it. And again, no peer review yet. So I'm not, so it's still kind of our finding without the needed scientific approach from to the accuracy of our analysis. But if we are right, it's also kind of quite a pessimistic question. So we invest so much in convince why it's important to pay taxes. At the end of the day, it's actually a very strong predictor of their intention. When it comes to the actual behavior, we don't see that effect, and sometimes it's even negative, which makes you wonder, should we actually invest so much in something where, if we actually care about behaviors? I mean, some people can say even tax attitudes are important because it affects how you vote, it affects other things. But if I'm only interested in how much tax I collect, you will not come from this chapter thinking, we should just try to convince people that paying taxes is the moral thing to do. It actually comes with not just that we couldn't find, the needed effect size or even in the, it comes also with certain prices. For example, what happened when you focus a lot on morality, and then some people feel that the policies of the government are not just. And therefore, if someone is paying tax because it's the moral thing to do, maybe now he might feel, you know what, actually, maybe I don't want to pay taxes to government doing certain things. Which goes back to one of the most fundamental questions of compliance. And this is also something I get a lot, whether compliance is even a democratic request, right? Maybe, we talk a lot about trust. Is trust a good thing? maybe we're actually better off having citizens being very suspicious of their governments. I mean, the whole idea of trust, because then it will lead to voluntary compliance, maybe it's not a good thing. The actually situation where people are very much kind of checking the policies of the government and raising a flag when you say, maybe I shouldn't pay taxes that much. And, from a compliance perspective, we want, we say, okay, if there are rules and everyone start to do what they want, we're going to, end up in anarchy. And some people will say, we don't want this, there is a harsher word will be obedience. So we don't want obedience. We do want people thinking, but then it's and this is more kind of a philosophical question, but it's really has an impact on compliance policies, where we stand in terms, for example, of, morality as part of, for example, tax compliance, because this could go both ways. And you would, on one hand, encourage governments to be seen as moral. On the other, what happens if they don't? And another concern, and I have a whole chapter, it's called the perils of voluntary compliance. It might lead governments to not to be moral, but to try to look moral. And there you have a whole kind of, people who engage in marketing, and governments, to some extent, do marketing now. They try to look nice to people. They try to look just, because we are in a world where voluntary compliance is seen as part of the package. People don't want to be coerced into compliance. And there's this recognition is there. But then the question is whether the government is actually doing the right thing or just wanting to appear to do the right thing. And they have their tools to try and mask it. And to some extent, the more you push in the direction of, more trust, more voluntary, less coercion, you might end up pushing governments to increase their efforts to, control the minds of the public, because it becomes more important. Fear is a very stable thing, and it's a very kind of no. I mean, if you don't pay taxes, we're going to know about you, and you're going to penalize you with 10 times the income. Okay, it's not realistic, but let's say under such a regime, then maybe everyone will pay taxes. They might be very upset, but they're still going to comply. So the question is that the only thing we care about, maximize tax compliance, or we are looking at it from a broader perspective? And, we mentioned COVID before. There are some studies now that suggest that because of relatively approach, many governments, even in kind of the developed countries, on, I wouldn't say forcing vaccination, but really pushing hard, getting the vaccine. We see now a decline in vaccination when it comes to children, for example, although some of those were tested for, 40, 50 years. So, some of the objection to the COVID vaccination was, it is no, record for it working for a long time because it was in. So this is another important insight, I think, for compliance is sometimes you succeed in the short term. And this is part of the problems with coercion. It's very effective in the short term, but you end up getting kind of a reaction in the long term in broader areas, not even related to COVID in the context of the vaccine, because you kind of created some feeling in kind of, okay, if it was that good, why they had to push it so hard?
So many things to come out of that. But what I find really interesting about your work is you focus in the public sphere for obvious reasons, right? So it's larger scale, there's more data available, all those sorts of things make sense. But as I look at it, in a way, and the beauty of it, I think, is that raises some of the complexities here. Because if I looked at the relationship in other compliance contexts of, say, an employer to the employee, even that's complex because of working from home and those sorts of questions. But the relationship is a little bit more defined. Or maybe a compliance process I have to go through with my bank that relates to being onboarded or payments I can make or whatever. Those are relatively confined environments. But what's really, as you were talking, I was just thinking about the knock-on consequences. If I don't trust the government, that plays through into a whole load of different spheres. And so it's really interesting, as you raise these issues, it's even more complicated in the public sphere than in the private sphere, I'd argue, because of the range of dynamics that are at play. So in other words, you could irritate me over here, and it manifests itself over there. And your point on the vaccines is a great one. It's sort of like, here's something that was a given. Through this latest change, we have undermined something that was already relatively solid.
Mm-hmm.
And so the knock-on, it's almost like one of those slidey puzzles where you move pieces around over here and something goes wrong over there. And so on the one hand, you say, well, that's just raising more complexity. But on the other hand, this is why I think your research is so valuable, because it starts to get you thinking about, this isn't just I think we often like to think of it in terms of sort of laboratory type things where, if we just look at this homogenized population, here's our intervention, the intervention's on its own. We forget the fact that people are salient because that's inconvenient. And we sort of solve that problem on its own. But these things are interrelated and therefore goes to the human relationships. And so you're raising it's dealing with that complexity point you made earlier. The not helping bit is exacerbated.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's why it's so interesting.
Definitely. And, part of the complexity, there are so many moving parts. So, for example, one of this that come out in the book, and especially in the context of voluntary compliance, is the idea of culture. So, in general, people understand that there are differences between countries. But, imagine that you are in one country, let's say you are in the UK, and then you heard about something that worked in Denmark. So they used a certain regulation which led, drivers not to drive into center of cities, or it caused something with, buying chemicals or consuming less meat, or all kind of things where, now kind of the behavioral public policies are being discussed. If you look at it, and I was amazed that there is no way to answer it. How do we kind of account for culture when we want to learn from one country to another? So something that worked in a different country, can you use it? Is there an easy way? Because it's very complicated to account for culture. It's not just let's reduce two, right? It's the whole, the whole kind of so many things related to institutions and social norms and legitimacy and solidarity. All of them are seen as predictors of compliance, are different in different, and sometimes it's even more, think about it in kind of, there is the kind of municipality, and then you have the state, and then you have the EU directives. And then, so you try to kind of understand the legitimacy of each one of these institutions in a given country. And this goes in even broader problems that we now try to use as everyone kind of algorithms and AI to help us. How do you actually take all the knowledge that we have on, we tried certain things to enhance compliance in a one domain, one country. Is there any good way to utilize all that information, especially of what didn't work? Right? There are so many failures out there. There is still no systematic way to actually capture it and try to predict what will work, right? So, scholars like me always try to convince policymakers, you should collect data, you should do experiments, you should do, experimental legislation is a big kind of trend now where you should not just, come up with a certain intervention, you should test it first. But it's not realistic. I mean, you can't really expect regulators or policymakers or even employers every time they want to do something to, do a pilot or collect data or randomly, especially because methodologically the requirements are quite high. I mean, on random assignment of sanctions, it will be like, lawyers will hate it, say, what do you mean random assignment of sanctions? How put more sanctions on some people while not on others, while they're both residents or citizens of the same country, just for the sake of improving causality or understanding what works. It's not very simple. And one can think that, with the current level of technology and machine learning and everything, we might be able to look at, decades of documented attempts to regulate, sometimes succeed, sometimes fails, to help us, do what's actually needed. And this is something we have now a team with computer scientists. We try also to advance that because, again, if you believe in voluntary compliance, you want to do it in the right place, you need a lot of data. You're unlikely to collect it every time. And again, so it's either as kind of, the opening question, you resort to command and control and say, this is simple. I know it, whether it's work or not, doesn't matter. No one go after a regulator for just saying, okay, I'm going to do mandates, I'm going to do command and because that's it's the easiest, it's less risky, less kind of, it's not as new, it doesn't involve trusting the public, doesn't involve. And so with less data, regulators will resort to the old school regulation, which we know from many other studies is problematic in other domains. If we can be smarter in how we get the data, not just would love it if everyone would collect data. It's not going to happen. It's unrealistic. We would not always have enough time. And definitely, in the real world, they just they don't have the resources, and it's very problematic. So the hope is, for example, that machine learning algorithms could help us understand or predict at the least that certain interventions are less likely to work and this is what algorithms are really good in, finding the most similar case in the past, and also can help us do the transformation from different countries in an easier way because they can control for many factors in the same time. And then at the least, we might have a more kind of, or help policymakers push them in the direction of smarter regulation, because at the least they will have some knowledge of the likely effect of the intervention they propose. And with more knowledge, the expectation is that they will take more risk and doing kind of more innovative regulatory techniques rather than, just let's play safe.
Reading between the lines, and correct me if you disagree with this, but it's almost allowing you to place more sophisticated bets, right? Because I think what your research brilliantly recognizes is that there are no guarantees here.
Mm-hmm.
And often we make a presumption that, oh, here's someone's done this brilliantly, I'm just going to copy that. And then they get into the real world equivalent of the replication crisis, which is this, that thing that worked in Sweden. Well, apparently, let's make a presumption it worked because they did it. We don't necessarily, we have no evidence whether it did or didn't, but it feels like it's an interesting way of doing it. We'll just copy that. And so I love the fact that you're challenging that thing of saying, what we managed to do in academia doesn't necessarily replicate the real. Well, what we do in country A or scenario A won't necessarily replicate. So the idea, I think, of using technology to sort of go, will give you a bit more assurance that this has a greater chance of succeeding,
mm-hmm.
recognizes the fact that there is no such thing as 100% guaranteed success.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're again increasing the level of discomfort that people might have.
Mm-hmm.
But I love it because I think it's brutally honest about things. And I think if we just said to people, look, even your tried and tested methods aren't guaranteed to work.
Right.
And so I love this idea if you're just sort of going, look, we're just trying to give you the strongest possible case, recognizing that it might not, but actually you're going to have to take a risk either way.
Right. And I think more than that, I definitely presenting the argument, I will say that, part of it's not just to kind of cause regulators to take the risk, but also give them a roadmap in what domain is it worthwhile for them to try and take the risk. And this will be dependent on a couple of factors. What's the downside? So let's say, that there's a different cost of mistake in different domains. In certain domains, if I'm trying something and it didn't work, okay, so we can try again. In some domains, actually, the cost of failing is very high. You don't always have a second chance. Maybe it's related to human. Maybe, it's related to some of the earlier arguments you mentioned about the proportion of compliance needed. So again, for example, I remember in COVID, there were talk about we need 60 to 70% vaccination for the vaccine to be effective in a given country. Because somehow the epidemiologists kind of calculated that, this is how many people you need. So if you only need 60 to 70%, to some extent, you can take more chances. Because, okay, let's say you are failing with certain people. If you get the bulk of the population to actually get the vaccine, maybe it's enough for you. So you have more leverage. Or let's say people didn't do it in the first time, or you try something smart, you can then after a month to more maybe aggressive intervention, or maybe do something because you still have sometimes the vaccine. Sometimes in some other domains, either 100% compliance. And again, I know in the past I said that we never need it, think, for example, on Coca-Cola trade secrets, right? Even if one employee goes out and tells everyone the recipe of Coca-Cola, again, I don't think it's a myth. I think it's still a trade secret, and whatever you think about the taste of. Yeah, I think it's still a trade secret. So, one employee, someone unhappy employee, going out of Coca-Cola, moving to Pepsi, or I don't know, and telling them the recipe, you can't undo it, right? I mean, and so one person, right? I don't know, maybe two people. I don't know how many people actually know the recipe, but you need 100% compliance, and you don't have room for mistakes, because once the secret is out, that's it. I mean, there's no way to reverse it. So in those kind of contexts, then you can't take chances, and you can't do voluntary compliance, and you can't test new approaches, because the tolerance for failure is not very high, or it's actually very low. Some other contexts, maybe, even if I get, I think some of the things I mentioned is like whistleblowing. In organizations, we sometimes want to create a scheme where people will actually say, safety regulations here there is some violation of safety, some accounting principles, maybe, I don't know, sexual harassment. So you want people to come up, and you want to encourage them to report internal reporting or external reporting to the authorities. You don't need everyone to run to the right. I mean, it's enough if you create some policies and you can then test them, because you need only few people will be brave and come out and say it. Again, I guess some people will say whistleblowing is bad, but that's a different discussion. But to the extent that we want to encourage, since we only need few people, and we can kind of try. We can take more risk. We can have the time to collect data, because it's not something that we need to happen in one day. If we have the time to redo it and get more information. So again, each of the regulatory domains will help you think what should be done, and also the value from it. And we thought that, for example, in the vaccine context, maybe, the quality of compliance is meaningless, right? We mentioned that. So, in those areas, maybe we should invest so much in doing voluntary, or we shouldn't trust people so much, because we can easily monitor it. We know if you get a vaccine or not, really, really simple. And your motivation is not important, because it's going to be as effective. At the same, and I'm making my argument even more complex, there are other considerations, and I actually mentioned them, right? Because long-term effect of vaccine campaigns was actually very sensitive, how it was presented to people. So again, I think the solution will not just say to regulators or policymakers, take more risk, but it will be, and this is kind of the chapter 11 of the book, everything it does is kind of suggest a roadmap of in what domains we should really consider trusting the public more. What's the kind of, in whether, given how high is the payoff, and maybe how low are the risk for failures, or kind of the negative consequences, then we should do. Again, no, one policy fit all in that regard. So, we want to trust the public, but we could, in a very nuanced way, and understanding in each doctrine whether it's actually makes sense for us as, either as a country or as an organization in those situations, to actually take the risk and try the more kind of softer, trust-based approaches, because the quality of compliance in those situations will be higher. The cost of mistakes are lower. You don't need as many people, and maybe the kind of the effect on changing culture, which is, again, it's an interesting question. When we talk about culture, is the culture of a country given? So this Southern Europe versus North Europe, and you have all those arguments. The question is whether it's stable, and regulators, policymakers should just say, okay, we should adapt to a given culture, by that predicting whether it's going to work or not, or we should be more ambitious and thinking maybe we can actually change culture. So, maybe a country is a low trust country, but maybe if all regulators in that country try to push in the direction to showing the public what's the benefit for them from having kind of a trust relationship with the government, maybe it could change. And there are some studies, talking about the Scandinavian countries and stuff like that, where you can actually shift trust. It's not given, although it looks like it. I mean, usually kind of the ranking are relatively stable over the years, but if you go, 100 years back, some countries definitely up in the trust index. So it means that those things are not affecting what you could do, but actually might be the other way around, where you take a more trusting approach to people, it might translate to greater trust.
You've got me smiling because I was thinking as you were talking about countries and not necessarily being homogenized, I was thinking about countries with the word united in their name, and I'm thinking of the US and the UK, and I would argue we've got evidence that neither of those places are united in terms of how they view governments or the world. But what I find really interesting is, and I love that you always point towards this. So you're never definitively concluding on things, always going, there's more complexity here to be unpicked. But if I think about that quality of compliance piece on, say, the vaccine or tax, where we could say, well, look, we don't really care. It's a one-off thing. But actually it's not, because to your point, one, the knock-on consequences actually, but I may need to go back for a booster.
Mm-hmm.
So you may need me to come back a second time to be effective later on down the track. I need to pay tax every single year. So we can look at it as a single transaction, but actually it's a long-term relationship. And they're always great examples because they resonate. But if you start to think about the nuance of them, to your point, it's much more complicated. Ditto with the homogeneity of populations. And so I guess what all of this points to is ultimately what we would need would be very, very if we want to solve this, and maybe it is insoluble, but we need very, very personalized solutions, which is maybe where the algorithm can. But that takes us into a really creepy space where why is so and so being told it this way? Why am I back to equality, fairness, and all those sorts of things? But what you're pointing towards, and actually maybe it needs to know my state of mind at the point at which they're getting to me, and that might change over time. So I guess there's a presumption that these things are often one-off shots, that we don't need to care about the aftermath, that people don't change, that nations don't change. So the landscape in which we're doing these things is also massively complicated.
Yeah. So two things. One, going back to the tax example not being one-off, I completely agree. I think more to the idea that, a reluctant taxpayer might be at the end of the day as honest as someone who is a true believer. Because the type of behavior is such where, okay, he needs to pay taxes also in the following year. But even when he gets to the following year, again, he could be saying, oh, I don't like taxes, they're too high, this is unfair. But at the end, he will actually end up paying. And it's not going to be different. So you have the money and that's it. In many other situations, if you do it reluctantly, and again, this is why the mask, the COVID mask is a good example. If you do it reluctantly, you will not going to cover your nose. You say, this is stupid. I just don't want the police to go after me. So I'm walking with the mask, but it's going to look like that and it's going to be ineffective. And actually, you kind of talked before about the employment context. You don't want employees who will do stuff reluctantly. I mean, actually workplaces more than states are areas where they want true believers. If their own employees will say, oh, okay, whatever, let me just do it, but I hate it, it's going to look like it. So those workplaces are even more sensitive to the intrinsic motivation level of their employees than states. But again, even states, it's the same when you think about trying, and especially the things it's harder to regulate. You can't prohibit eating meat. I think, all right, it will be strange, right? You can't, a lot of the behavioral things, we want true believers because if people you can't run after them all the time, make sure they are behaving in an environmentally friendly way. So it's only going to work. I mean, you can use taxes, and I'm not saying they're ineffective, but it's never going to cover everything when you talk about environmental behavior. You want people to wash their hands, right? It's a classic public health regulation. If they're not true believer, it's really going to have a hard time getting it from people, because even if they put their hands and are going to use soap, not properly, not for enough time, you need people, at least in the health professional, to really care about it, or else it's not going to work. So this is kind of the difference. So I agree with what you say on the one-off, in tax, it's a multiple thing, but I think you can see and then the other point I wanted to make, actually now I forgot what I wanted to say.
It'll occur to you probably 5 minutes after we finish recording.
Yeah.
That's normally
Okay.
Thinking about situations I've come across, both personally but also work-wise. It's interesting when we talk about voluntary. Of course, it's not a binary thing, and you've hinted towards being able to shift from. But I guess it's easier to shift from voluntary to sort of coercion than it is the other way round. But there's a balancing act here, and you could, I guess, if I thought about public transport as a good example, I travel a lot by train. I see various means of controlling. So everything from ticket barriers and no inspectors on trains to no ticket barriers and ticket inspectors with heavy authority, to a mixture of those things. And so what that illustrates to me is that again, as ever with these things, there's nuance and balance here. So I guess what you're pointing towards, I think, is to say that actually there's a range of tools here. And I guess we should think about not just which toolkit, but what options might that leave open for us later on. If we go down a particular path, we may shut off certain options, and we may be able to have multiple options in place at the same time.
I mean, I think, and this is the beauty and the complexity, because a lot of those things are relatively new. I mean, think, the nudge of Sunstein and Thaler was written, I think it was 2008 around. So, it's not alone. It's like, 70, and so much data was accumulated and it's created this whole field of now hundreds of possible interventions. And again, now it becomes not just, whether to take risk or not. So how to choose from so many, and, the whole, again, pushing policymakers into data collection, which I think is a very important, but can you really test hundreds of intervention every time? You can't, right? So you end up going into either we do what we did last year or all kind of heuristic or what's going to work. So, and to some extent you end up, and there are all kind of studies where you have, too many options actually lead people to suboptimal solutions. So, regulators with all those interventions that researchers keep pushing will end up saying, I just can't deal with it. And this is also another thing to consider when, as you said, there are more and more options, and just, taking the approach of what works is very problematic. And I think you probably know that it's kind of famous that Katie Milkman, right? So from Wharton, and she is very famous for doing the really huge, large scale nudges where she tries, how to push people, to go to the gym or environmental things, health related things. And she sometimes do like an expert survey where people need to predict. So experts in the field need to predict what's going to work. And it's actually a negative correlation, which is amazing. So it means that not just that it's less than chance in a sense, right? So, supposedly it's supposed to be zero, right? The correlation between what expert predicted and what actually worked at the end was negative, which suggests that we are in an area where people work in the area can't predict what's going to work, and they'll say, yeah, this is why you need to collect data. But again, it's not going to work it's not, and this is on us, on researchers, to be able to at least positively predict what's going to work, or else we, coming up with all kind of full intervention. And as you say, I think public transportation is an interesting domain for all kind of tricks, being how to get people to pay. But without knowledge or theory and say, this is going to work. And again, going back to the algorithmic argument I mentioned before, without some solid basis to tell policymakers, we think this is probably a better route than the other direction. Just telling them collect data, whatever. I don't think it's a direction that will be sustainable. They're just going to stop listening to us.
One of the things I always ask you when we speak is about the personal impact your work is having on you. And I always learn something interesting. How have you found I mean, this has been a subject that's been brewing in your mind and in your research for some time. But how have you found looking at this and the reaction to it and sort of in terms of your own personal view on the world and how you're impacted by it when it's imposed on you?
Yeah. So we'll come to that. In the meantime, I'll remember what I forgot before. And you asked about the personalization. And this is what I said. We also have some papers trying to predict. Let's say you are really bad in tax. To what extent it predicts how you drive? And to what extent? So there is the descriptive domain. So how misbehavior in one domain affect misbehavior in another domain descriptively. Then there is the normative aspect, which is even more interesting, right? So, a lot of people say, what's you like to have this say, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So some people say, you know what, I'm a very compliant person, except for the road. I'm actually a really bad driver, but this will be a violation of my privacy, autonomy, etc. if my driving style or compliance will be affecting how the tax authority view me. And it's actually very interesting to capture people's intuition on why they object to it so much. Because again, going to the personalization, the more information we are allowed to use about people's past behavior, we're better off, especially in an algorithmic world, we're better off actually than accurate whether we could trust them or not. This raises a lot of problems, and the whole kind of social score related to China, all of that. People don't like it so much. And this is why I think I mentioned before that especially legal audiences come up with the idea that if the choice is between trusting no one and trusting some people, we prefer trusting no one. So we prefer that everyone will not be trusted than a regime in which some people who showed that they can be trusted will be trusted and some people cannot, because then you might end up finding it's related to attributes which we don't like in constitutional law or we don't like in general, might be related to all kind of socioeconomic. So this is the personalization. I think we know a lot about people now. And the main constraint is not algorithmic, but it's legal. And it's legal and it's, I think, related to people's intuition. People don't like it. People don't like the idea that past affect the future, although it makes sense to them. So, if it's in one domain, if someone has many violations, people understand that we need to treat them differently in the road. Somehow they reject it when it will move to a different domain. And it's interesting why. Like, okay, if someone is, especially if descriptively, it is a good predictor.
That's super. I'm just thinking that's super interesting in a corporate context, because as I look at, I'll take banking, the industry that I know best. And I'd never thought about it in this way, but it is kind of, if you get 5 strikes from a loosely defined conduct perspective, they're assumed to be equally valid strikes. And they assume predictive capabilities implicitly, that you're somebody we need to look out for. And you're right, I hadn't thought about it. I mean, the driving in taxis, this is what I love about what you do, because your examples actually prompt me to think about other ones that are more new. And so that does happen quite a bit. And so that is the basis of quite a few programs where there's a sort of a simplistic presumption.
Right.
And I guess if there's one conclusion that I would draw from all of this is it's complicated.
Yes.
But that's the point.
Yeah. And actually you mentioned the corporate compliance and there is this normative paper with Orly Lobel and Ori Aronson, when one of our recommendations is to start with corporations, because the violation of autonomy, when it comes to the corporation, so, past behavior of corporation as something which will inform policymakers on how to treat this corporation, creates less objection And also you have more data points, right? So with the corporations, you know a lot about their past behavior. It's less related to group. All the problems with are you poor, not poor? I mean, many of those things are less related when it comes to cooperation. And probably this is actually going to work better if we use corporate past behavior to predict how much trust they can be given even in a new domain. So I think I really like the shift to cooperation because I think there it's more justifiable. It's going to be more effective. And a lot of the kind of constitutional objection, although corporation obviously have rights, but not some of the autonomy, privacy things are not as sensitive as when it comes to people.
And let me take you back to that question. Thank you for that. It was great. Glad you remember where you were going to go with it. The question about how it's impacted you personally.
So I think it's eating in a sense, and maybe again, it's related to the shift from an optimistic starting point. Yeah, we should trust people to finishing that. A lot of situation you see government say, we should actually try soft. And although kind of, the research, in your heart, it's not going to work. And I can think of some kind of context that we have in my country when they think, for example, I don't know, the ultra-Orthodox, how to, and then we say, no, you should just explain. You should just, use reason. It's going to work. But then they keep doing it and it's not working. And, people say, oh, you should just use, financial penalties. That's the only thing that's going to work. And to some extent, it's kind of, exactly knowing all the research is kind of sad that you sometimes see situations where there is this feeling that, maybe economists got it right after all. You spend your life kind of showing they're wrong. And, incentives, it's only a small part of the picture. You should be much smarter than that. But then, I don't know, things sometimes only money has the impact on people. And it's kind of sad, but I think, we should definitely, and sometimes I think a lot of psychologists like to underestimate incentives. And I think maybe because I have this also the legal side and I'm more exposed to the other disciplines, we shouldn't downplay the effect of money on people.
But it's sort of I look at it as kind of a nuclear weapon thing, right? Is that it's very, very effective and that we can't, this is where the analogy falls apart. We can go there if we need to, but it's like, shouldn't we try some other things before we go to that? Because the one thing we know, and I always use the example of kids, once you turn something into a financial transaction, one, it's very difficult to get away from it being a financial transaction. But two, there's one concept they understand really well, which is inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes this spiraling thing. So I guess the conclusion I could draw from what you've just said is, depressing as that is, even if they're right, they've sort of stumbled across the extreme thing that we can't move away from,
Mm-hmm.
that comes with increased costs. And once we're there, we can't get back away from it.
You're right. Yeah, that's the whole crowding out, finding the price paradigm. Yes. I don't know. I mean, maybe, sometimes it's actually could be the opposite where some behaviors are so internalized that if you want to change them, reason, it's not, you need to somehow shake the system for it to change. And especially if it's not one individual, but it's a whole kind of, maybe a whole kind of group culture where, you can talk and people want listen, you want to get their attention. And again, I definitely agree with you. And, my discipline or my education, I'm supposed to be against incentives and against sanctions, but, sometimes you can't move things or even, get people to start listening to you before really you do something which is actually, making certain behaviors so expensive that now people say, okay, maybe I'm not going to own a car. Right. I mean, ideally say, no, we should explain to people why it's better for the environment, but maybe sometimes you need a shock to get even people to listen because they're so used to a certain behavior. And if you make, I don't know, owning a second car, third car, I don't know, all that very inefficient for them, maybe only then they'll say, oh, okay, now you get me listening. So the order, although, responsive regulation, you always have this idea, start soft and then escalate. Sometimes it could be also the reverse. You want to have a to get people to listen to you and take you seriously, and especially if you want them to adopt a new behavior, just by kind of the softer, like sugar tax versus, labeling. It's a whole debate. Sometimes, labeling, people will not even notice that. You do something, you make them, oh, now I understand it's actually, and maybe then it's not, I'm not saying sugar tax should be adopted or anything, but sometimes it does the job of getting people to listen.
Love that. Dramatic intervention. I was sort of thinking kind of, it's sort of heart attack logic of, oh, okay, we'll go on a diet now because I've experienced something horrific. So it sort of makes sense. Before I let you go, what's next on the research agenda? I mean, you're never done, right? You just, it's so obvious speaking to you that you're naturally curious about this subject and you want to understand it better and share that with the rest of us. Where's your research taking you now?
So now increasingly, and I am ashamed to say because it's so trendy, but I too very curious about the effect of AI on governance. I'm trying to take it to actually non-legal areas. So in a sense of kind of maybe, for example, we have this, should we do formal laws or social norms? Maybe AI could actually be a game changer in our ability not to use law to change behavior. So a lot of the problems associated with social norms could be remedied with AI in terms of, consistency, knowledge about what others are doing, a lot of those problems. So I'm trying to understand more, and I have some working papers on the ability to use AI for things which are not just algorithmic, is kind of, but actually using them to supplement and get people, because again, you can see it in a lot of my research. I'm very critical on the ability of law to change, and sometimes we use law because we can't trust the, private code, social norms, all those things. I'm trying to examine whether algorithms and AI could push us more to non-legal interventions, giving us a lot of the things which are currently missing. So this is kind of my next big project.
Love it. And so the thinking is that AI will, because it can crunch larger data sets and spot patterns that we can't spot, it will, so rather than or is the AI part of the intervention, or is the AI going to help us work out what the intervention is?
It will help us know, for example, more what's the social norm. It will help us, there is, a series of objections for why non-legal intervention fail. Some of them could be solved with, more accurate information, better predicting a bit, which might, again, I'm not suggesting to abandon law. It might also make law better in some of its own limits, but I think it's more interesting to think about kind of the governing, the non-legal governing mechanism, which might be enhanced by our ability to know more, predict more, be more kind of consistent, which is, without institution, that's the main problem of non-legal. And the question is whether AI could replace institutions.
Wow. Love it. Keep going, because your research, as we've discovered, is absolutely fascinating. Before I let you go, remind people what the book is called.
Can the public be trusted? The Promise and Perils of Voluntary Compliance. And it's open access from Cambridge University Press. So you get to the and just read the book. So maybe I'm actually against my interest of getting any royalties from the book, which is not a big deal anyway, but it's actually open access.
Which I love. I was going to say for that, thank you so much. I was astonished to see that. It's a rare, normally things in the academic world are paywall to hell and come with a very expensive price point. So thank you so much for doing that, because I think having your research in as many places as possible, super important, which is why I was delighted to have you back on the show. So thank you for writing the book. Thank you for making it open access. But above all, thank you for being an amazing guest on the show.
Thank you so much, Christian. It was, as always, a pleasure to talk with you, and keep doing what you do.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks, as ever, to you for listening. And of course, to Professor Yuval Feldman for appearing. To find out more about Yuval, his research, his open access book, yes, it's free to download. Can the public be trusted? Have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. You'll also find links to his previous appearances on the show, which I highly recommend for obvious reasons. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It is available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show, then please do leave a rating or review for it. It really helps other people to discover the show and allows me to continue to attract high-quality guests like Yuval. If you are relatively new, you've probably missed some episodes. In that case, you want to head over to the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. There are over 340 of them now, so I'm sure there's something there for you to enjoy, not least the previous episodes featuring Yuval. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Thank you so much for listening.